Well, good evening, everybody. I am hopeful that this is working the way that I want it to, where you can see um, me talking in the bottom corner of your screen, and also see what is on my screen. I have no idea if this is going to do what I want it to do, but we're going to find out. This is actually attempt number 2 for me at trying to get this up and going. I boogered the first time, and so hopefully this time things are working the way that it is supposed to work. Um, so last week I put out a poll asking what y'all wanted to do with these Wednesday night videos. And I can say in honesty that the overwhelming response was that you wanted to talk about cities in the ancient world and a little bit of the history there. But it's only overwhelming because only one of you gave me any direct feedback. Now, several of you have talked about wanting these videos to continue, but you passed on your opportunity to have any say in what they were. So I believe it was Nita McKenzie. I could be wrong on that. Sorry, Nita, if I blamed you for something that you didn't have input on. But somebody responded back and said that this would be their preference. So for the next, I don't know how many weeks, we are going to talk about cities in the ancient world, life in those cities, a little bit of their history and where we see that show up in Scripture. So we'll talk about Rome tonight. We'll talk about Jerusalem and Ephesus and Corinth and how those places have some things that are similar and some things that are different. We'll talk about life in the ancient world and how culture influences some of the images and words and ideas that we get in Scripture. And tonight, we will start that in Rome. Now, I'll first say that I wish I could take credit for the PowerPoint presentation that you're going to see here in a second, but I cannot. Dr. David De Silva, professor at Asbury Theological Seminary, put this slideshow together. I'll skip through a couple of slides relatively quickly that aren't necessarily important to me or I think pertinent to how I'm presenting. But the other side of that is if you finish this video and you found that presentation interesting, holler at me. It's easy enough to share with you. Also, if you want to know more about how civilization and culture influences Scripture, Dr. De Silva is a really good source on that. He is a skilled historian and a top-notch theologian, and combining those two to talk about where he sees like culture poking through Scripture or how Scripture is directly addressing culture, like specifically in the book of Revelation. He is a fantastic source and has written a couple of books, and I'd be happy to share those with you as well. For tonight, we're going to talk about the city of Rome. Now, I wish I could say I've been to Rome. I have not. It is on the to-do list, but my guess is I'm going to have to get 3 small children out of the house first, because taking Lindsay and I to Rome is way more affordable than taking me, Lindsay, Hunter, Hadley, and Hayes to Rome. And also, I don't think we would enjoy the same things in Rome. And I want to do way more history, and I think Hayes would be looking for a theme park, which I'm sure exists in Rome, but is about 20 centuries later than what we are talking about tonight. I'm going to hit play on the slideshow, and we will start it from the beginning. You can see this is an appropriate title. Rome is the city. Rome is the heart of the empire. And he makes a reference here in just a few minutes as he talks about the Forum kind of being the heart of Rome. Rome, in and of itself, had not been a place of great importance for the first few hundred years of its existence. So most historians will tell you that like the official founding of Rome as a city, remember we're talking mostly about Rome as a city, not Rome as an empire tonight, comes around 753 BCE, so 753 years before the turn of the era, before the birth of Jesus. But actually, most modern archaeological evidence puts it 100 years even before that. And it was not like a city overnight. It starts as a small village. There are these 7 hills right along the river. And it's in the ancient world especially, building on hills, a place that you have a view of the land and environment around you, and some heads up as to whether or not people are making their way your direction with good or ill intent. Was and access to water's a good place to build a city. There were some downsides to the location that plagued the people of Rome constantly, because there are these high points. Any rain, water, later human waste and sewage that gets dumped out runs to the low points. It was very swampy, as you can imagine. Like, sanitation was not great in the ancient world. Medical practices were, we'll go with, less than ideal, and disease spread usually kind of from those swamps outwardly. As you can imagine, the low-lying water is a breeding ground for mosquitoes and for bacteria, and a combination of those things tends to go very poorly. So throughout Rome's history, there would be these blow-ups of epidemics that would just kind of run through the population. Early on, when the population was small, not as big a deal, but as Rome moved from small village in the 8th century, which for timeline's sake is around the same time of Hosea, for, or Amos for your Old Testament kind of timeline purposes. It grew over time. Kind of becomes a city state with a king around the 4th century, and then starts slowly growing from there and fighting wars with its neighbors. It slowly over time builds its power. It wasn't this thing that just blew up overnight. It was an impressive city, certainly in the ancient world, but a lot of what it did was a copy of Greece, to the point where even as the empire grew, it adopted Greek in addition to Latin as official languages of the empire. In fact, under certain emperors, in order to be considered for citizenship, you had to be able to speak both Latin and Greek, or bribe an official, which is always an effective way in the Roman Empire to get something done, to lie on official government paperwork that you could speak Latin and Greek. Again, De Silva being a scholar of this kind of culture and of its history, loops in Revelation, talking about the great city. City on 7 hills, the 7 kings, is again straight out of the book of Revelation, and it points directly to Rome. And you were talking about a place that consumed a vast majority of the world's wealth and goods, not just in the city, but certainly in the city, a disproportionate amount. By the 1st century, the estimated population of the city of Rome is somewhere between 450,000 and a million. Of course, those numbers fluctuate depending on what's going on at any given point. Just in general, ancient populations were much more in flux than modern populations, for obvious reasons. I say that, but certainly more so than American populations. Like we talked in class the other day about imperial edicts banishing populations from areas, like when Claudius kicked the Jews out of Rome. That changes your population numbers, but if the larger number of that is accurate, then Rome was probably the last place with a population of 1 million people until the 19th century in Europe. Now, there could be some fuzziness on that, simply because most scholars don't do a good job of taking into account large city populations in Far East Asia, just because not as much is known, or in South America. But you can imagine a population even of 500,000 people in the 1st century requires a significant infrastructure to support it. And Rome did that with aqueducts and intentional public works projects like baths and toilets. It was not sanitary. The sewage system in Rome it's not good, and it wasn't built with the desire to keep the city clean. It was built, the sewage system was, to deal with rainwater and getting it away from places of population. So sure, some like baths and public toilets dumped into the sewer system, but for the most part in the city of Rome, especially outside of the nice stone areas, in places where stick wood construction was more common, or away from the main sewer lines, the way that human waste was handled was in chamber pots, and they were just dumped out the window onto the streets. Also, why foot washing was considered important in the ancient world is because some of the places you went, the street and the sewer served basically the same function. The aqueduct system, however, bringing large amounts of water into Rome, is one of the reasons that the population was able to grow to the size that it was. Without water, you cannot support a civilization that size. I think some estimates show that they were able to bring in 255 gallons per person per day into the city. And if that number is accurate and you combine that with 500,000 to 1 million people in population, you can understand that they were moving huge amounts of water, which is impressive. And you can understand why people on the outside looking in would see both the ingenuity and the consumption, both the good and the bad, of a place like Rome. And those aqueducts also become part of the wall system, part of the city gates, part of the public propaganda system. If you want to bust out your Latin and read that, it's in praise of the Emperor Vespasian and his completion. You can see Divine Caesar Vespasian, the full name spelled out here. Yeah, absolutely. And that sort of public celebration was incredibly key to, I think, Rome's success. The mentality was bread and games, but it really was, if you can keep stomachs full and you can keep people entertained and engaged, you can manage to keep a population together. Now, Rome accomplishes that both through public works, bread and games, and also with a culture that was very much oriented towards the law. And that, I think, is incredibly interesting when you start reading Romans and how Paul talks about the Torah, the law. And in some ways, he does it very subtly, so much so that if you don't know, you don't notice it. And I think this is probably true for most of us. But what Paul is often doing when he talks about, this is my opinion, when he talks about Jewish law, is also indirectly dealing with how, Romans, non-Jews in the church in Rome, were oriented towards their own law. So like in chapter 13 of the book of Romans, verse 8, I think, Paul says something to the effect of, owe nothing to anyone except, hold on just a second, I'll pull it. Except for your obligation to love one another. Well, Roman law was very much the negative connotation is tit for tat, or a quid pro quo. It is this benefactor and benefacted system. So much so that, once you were indebted and the whole system functioned on this level of indebtedness, a person's power and a person's authority was measured not by the wealth in their bank accounts, because there were some incredibly powerful broke people. And it wasn't measured by their seat in the Senate or the Forum or anything like that. It was measured by how many people showed up at their door in the morning. Because what you did, if you had a benefactor, straight away every day, was to start by checking in with them. And so you would see a line outside somebody's door, and it was people coming by as a way of remembering their indebtedness, a way of honoring this person who had benefited them. And that sort of, the benefactor might give out gifts, might be another loan, it might be just a salutation. But it was very much this system of Um, I scratch your back, you scratch mine. I take care of you, you take care of me. And it was understood that you owed allegiance to the emperor. You owed um, allegiance to your benefactor, and those things are important for holding together a population, especially one that size and that diverse. Rome was maybe one of, if not the most diverse cities that existed until the modern world. People were brought in as slaves from all over the empire. As Rome goes out, slaves come back. It was also very common to free slaves who were then still indebted to you in this system. Do you understand that, Roman systems of slavery and antebellum Southern slavery are simply not the same thing? Um, but then there was this owing, this system. And Paul also knew that making sure that people paid attention to that was a good way to not end up on the wrong side of things, which is why even earlier in chapter 13, he talks about submitting to the government and paying attention to the authorities. It's very much an echo of Jesus: given to Caesar what is Caesar, give unto God what is God. It's this recognition that you live in a system and you have to navigate that, and that giving honor where honor is due and not tossing it as a whole matters. But there's also this recognition that God's kingdom operates differently, um, and that it is important that we not bring those outside systems. It was important for them to not bring those outside systems of benevolence and benefaction and then allegiance and owing into the church, because then it becomes a church oriented towards itself and not towards Christ. Um, Huge numbers of temples that spread throughout Rome. Definitely a reminder of how important um, the in some ways Rome was a theocracy, just not a monotheocracy. Um, Different emperors either demanded or were eventually deified. The forum itself is surrounded by uh, temples to different gods. Um, these legal proceedings that it's talking about here often took place in temples or quasi temples, or surrounded by temples. Like, you could not walk into Rome and not have a very similar experience to what Paul has walking into Athens. And some emperors, especially like Nero, that was what they wanted, was to feel the majesty that those cities had brought back to Rome. Visitors from places like Athens were not as impressed with Rome because what they had, um, Rome was simply not considered as beautiful as. Um, but if you were into size, and bigger is always better and all of that, um, nothing could top Rome. Again, more pictures of the Forum, more pictures of the temples. Temple worship in Rome could get pretty raucous depending on which temple you were at. Those parties and those celebrations also often spilled out into the streets. Obviously, there was, depending on which god or goddess was being worshipped, a sexual component to all of that. Like, it's just and all of that, you've got to remember that all of that baggage comes with people into the church. And so, like, stuff like the tail end of Romans chapter 1 and the early part of Romans chapter 2, when Paul talks about idol worship, is not generic. Paul is not talking generically. He's talking specifically to Romans about how the worship of these gods and their actions in worship to those gods, while part of their past is shameful, but also this recognition, I think maybe specifically to Jewish believers who saw that either in the backgrounds of some Roman church members or maybe ongoing among some Roman church members, are reminded that they don't get to be the ones to condemn. However terrible they think what is going on, however bad it is simply not their job to condemn and to reject people because of what they have done or are doing. because there's something much bigger, much more important that they're moving towards. And people come from all sorts of places through all sorts of things to God. And if you start shutting people down early, you're going to end up missing out in the process. Yeah, sorry. Lots of temple pictures here. And then we get to the assassination of Julius Caesar, who very interestingly was proclaimed emperor by the Senate, assassinated by senators for being proclaimed emperor, and then declared divine by the Senate shortly thereafter. And in hindsight, like reading through it, a lot of it was not that they had an issue with Caesar, it was that they had an issue with how he was going about what he was doing. Now, some of his stuff hadn't been great. And he did some things that hadn't been done before. But again, if he's moving towards a type of imperial power that simply hadn't existed before, then it's not surprising that he's doing things that hadn't done. And what's really interesting is after all is said and done, 10 years after Caesar's assassination, the Civil War is kind of winding down, and his adopted son is declared emperor. So the thing that got him assassinated is then passed on to his kid intentionally. And again, I point that out because it wasn't what he was doing, it was how he was doing it, which is very, very Roman. It's not the thing itself, it's how you get to that point that causes problems in the Roman world. And so Paul is having to navigate some of that. And I think probably is very intentional in not picking sides in some arguments, but trying to remind people that where they are moving towards is more important than how they're doing it, which is a very countercultural expectation for Gentiles, not so much for the Jewish group amongst them. Skip back through some of these again. There we go. We get to some new emperors here. Caesar Augustus, that would be the imperial title for Julius's adopted son, has a nice long reign. He is actually the one who is on the throne when Jesus is born. Provides peace to an empire that had been at war constantly. Of course, peace in the Roman Empire came at the tip of the sword, and they were never really done fighting on the frontiers of the empires. They were always dealing with some uprising, some group that was unhappy, some warring tribe from somewhere else trying to expand their territory, whether that's Gauls or Visigoths or something like that. There's always those groups out there, but for the most time and for the bulk of the people inside the empire, the time that Jesus is born into is one of heightened peace. And for the most part, with the exception of a couple of emperors, you've got pretty consistent rule. Now, Caligula was nuts, but shortly after his death, his uncle ends up on the throne, who again brings back some peace and some measure to an empire that had just gone through a chaotic period. And then you get Nero, who for the first 5 years of his reign was solid, and that's because he was 16 and not allowed to do anything. Instead, he had a group of like 5 advisors that kind of did all of the work. They did it in his name. He was happy to not mess with any of it. As they all die off and he takes more and more control, and his own questionable mental health begins to show up, things get a little bad. Now, one of those classic rumors is that he played his fiddle while Rome burned. He didn't play fiddle, he played lyre, not quite the same thing. And when the Great Fire in Rome started, he was actually out of town. So he had to rush back, actually put in some effort in the firefighting himself. He opened up his palace to refugees. It's incredibly unlikely that he started the fire, but we do have a couple of eyewitnesses who talk about gangs of men who wouldn't allow firefighters to do their job. And everybody assumed that it was Nero, but it may very well have been that after a place burns, you can get away with looting and plundering, and people saw an opportunity to take advantage of that. I doubt any of them on night one knew that 70% of the town was going to burn across the next 10 days. First fire burned for 6. They got it put out. Winds calmed down and then kicked back up, and it rekindled and burned some more. Um, but in the aftermath, what we know as what we know as ancient Rome really begins to build up. Because 70% of the town had burned. I think out of 14 districts, only 4 were untouched. There was now this massive rebuilding project. And instead of rebuilding in sticks, something that burned easily, they rebuilt in stone. Now, people were blaming Nero, so he had to find somebody else to blame and blamed Christians. The fire had started uh, in a market games area, and the small group of Christians was known for not participating, cheering the games, not participating in market life to the same extent, and the area of town that had housed the small but dominant Christian population had not burned. And so the Christians got called out. Nero began by putting Christians to death, not in the Colosseum, which did not exist yet, but in some other gladiatorial arenas, tossing them to animals. But persecution didn't go empire wide. It was very much localized to Rome. Christians, in a lot of cases, fled Rome at this point, but others didn't. And this is likely when Paul and Peter are put to death, both of whom were known to be in Rome at the time, though we have no actual record of either of their deaths in Rome, in a Colosseum. All we have is legend. It seems likely, but again, no information to back it up entirely. Domitian is emperor towards the end of the first century. He is the one who fires off the next kind of persecution of Christians, but again, it takes place in Rome. It is kind of isolated and limited. There is no empire-wide persecution of Christians in the way that we have often talked about it. It simply does not happen until the mid-3rd century, around the year 250, I think. Maybe closer to 300 CE, AD. Now, that doesn't mean there weren't sporadic and intense persecutions of Christians isolated along the way. Certainly there were. We've talked about a couple of them, and there were others. But this whole idea of the Roman Empire out to get Christians does not happen, again, on an empire-wide basis until much, much, much later. And in that case, it's for a relatively short period of time, and not that much later, Christianity is the official religion of the empire. That empire-wide persecution was kind of like the last gasp of ancient Roman religion, which considered Christians atheists because they didn't believe in the gods. Just kind of humorous. Outside of the wealthiest district of Rome, before the Great Fire, it was very much stick and mud building. It's the type of place that a fire would burn through very quickly, and certainly did. Because of the sporadic outbreaks of disease, and that's not the only fire that hits Rome either. It was a highly superstitious place, and especially with as many temples and gods and deities that were floating around, those outbreaks were often blamed on a lack of observance, and then pinned on groups like Christians or Jews or some other ascetic group that was not part of the main imperial cult. Now, you can imagine that creates a world that is very suspicious of anybody that isn't like them. And that makes it all the more difficult for groups like Romans and Jewish Christians to blend together in a community, which is why we see those challenges reflected in Paul's writing in Romans. It's why we see the book of Revelation, which is, in all its apocalyptic imagery, really a book about navigating life in the Roman world and how what God sees from the Roman Empire is not good, as much as the empire itself wants to glorify it. It is evil and not a blessing. Um, Especially as emperors begin to call themselves gods in their own lifetime, like Domitian did. Um, you start having larger and larger issues with people who wouldn't worship the gods. We have a letter from a Roman. We have 100 letters from a Roman prefect named Pliny, serving in Bithynia in the first century under Emperor Trajan. And one of the things he writes Trajan about is how to deal with this superstitious group called Christians. And he talks about getting information about the group by torturing a couple of slave women who happened to be part of the group. And the process at the time was to provide them an opportunity to recant is the word, but it's not really recant. It's just showing allegiance to the emperor. And if they could show allegiance to the emperor, then they weren't considered a problem. And so you see, again, some of that sporadic, unintentional. Trajan tells Pliny, don't go seeking them. The problem at that point was that people looking to score points or get rid of competition were denouncing other people as Christians left and right, whether or not they were. And Pliny's having to navigate that in around the same time that the letters of John are written. Just to give you again a timeline for what we're working with, and so you're having to figure out what it's like to be a follower in a world that is dominated by a very unholy power. And I think that's why we do a better job of reading scripture when we do so with some understanding of this. It's like when we talk about law in the book of Romans, and we're dealing with both Jewish law and Roman law, and the ways in which, in both cases, they were held up as a power unto themselves. And Paul's got to kind of undo a little bit of that and help them understand that they're living for something bigger while still operating in that world. And so it's important, what's the phrase, to be in the world, not of the world. But for our first century audience, and certainly for the people who are on the receiving end of the book of Romans, Rome was the world. And it had some very specific views on what was and wasn't acceptable, often under threat of exile or death. Yeah. All right. I think that gives us, I'm trying to think if there's anything I intended to cover tonight. I'm trying to keep it relatively short, but that's already gone longer than I wanted to. All right. We'll call that good. If you have questions, I'm certainly up for answering them. If you want more resources, holler at me and I'll see if I can get you some stuff. I think next week we'll talk about Jerusalem. Certainly, for Jewish followers of Jesus in the early world and for our New Testament writers, the most important city in their lives. As far as the Roman Empire was concerned, it was not all that important. And that actually comes into play. So glad you were with us. We'll be back at it again next week with a new city and a new setting.